Mr. Marcos, I don't want to cut you off.
Tyler and I can.
We can pull
We can disregard personal.
We can pull this more backwards, the table.
I think it's fine. Yeah. I think it's good. Okay. Cool. Is it actually running? Yeah. Great. Okay. Sweet.
The awkward run.
Yeah. Welcome to EF Academy 2023 prescribed titles for TOK. I'm Mr. Johnson, and we have two awesome TOK seniors with us today. Namita on my left and Tyler on my right. The TOK teacher on the panel today is Mr. Markowitz. Thank you, Mr. Markowitz.
Pleasure. And
our honorary faculty member is Mr. Ravone from mathematics. Thank you. Let's clap for all the participants. All right, so PT number 1 for this year is an interesting statement. It says, is replicability necessary in the production of knowledge? Okay, so the first thing we always do as a habit in TOK is think about our key terms and try to define them. And the job here is both easy and hard because we don't have a lot of key terms, namely replicability, which is, by the way, internet, that's hard to say and spell, I think. And also necessary. So I want to actually address necessary first. The first thing we should flag about necessary is similar to universal or the word always. And so whenever we see a PT with this type of word, we know it's going to be kind of easy to find a counterexample. You know, if we have one case of this not being true, then we are capable of disagreeing with the question. So that said, maybe we can get a first kind of provisional answer from our panelists, just looking at the question as it stands and knowing the power of necessary. Let's start with Namita, maybe. Okay. Namita, to what extent do you agree with this?
I disagree.
Disagree, okay. You don't need to explain now. Tyler?
I somewhat agree.
Somewhat agree, okay. Mr. Markowitz?
I would say in some areas of knowledge, it's absolutely necessary, and in other areas of knowledge, it is sometimes necessary.
Okay, so we'll toggle based on the AOK. And Mr. Ravone?
I might have to agree with Mr. Markowitz on this. About some area of knowledge, I would think that you absolutely have to be able to replicate an experiment in order to consider it knowledge, as opposed to just hypothesis or theory.
Right.
I would also revise my answer and say yes, in some scenarios like it would be necessary, but in most I would say no.
Okay, you have already demonstrated IB learner profile reflective.
Absolutely.
Changes the mind.
Absolutely. Okay, and then key term number 2, of course, is this difficult to pronounce, difficult to spell word, replicability. So in attempting to pin this down for us, I came up with this operational phrase, which is an if-then statement, which is logical. Okay, this is a great statement, TOK students of the world. So here it is. If someone, or any researcher, does perhaps not an experiment, but a process of inquiry, does some kind of process of pursuing knowledge, again, she or he repeats it, then that same researcher or group of researchers will get the same result. Okay, so I want to pin that down as our operational definition, if everyone's okay with that. Does that sound okay? I get a thumbs up from Mr. Markowitz.
I'm good with that.
Let me repeat it. I'll replicate it. Let me say this one more time. If someone does some process of inquiry, again, then they will get the same result. And now, same is going to be another key word that's going to come up, I think, as we go through different AOKs. So I think within this definition, maybe sameness, what sameness means in these different contexts, may be problematic. Okay, interestingly, this PT says for you guys to discuss with reference to 2 areas of knowledge, which is very fascinating. The IB recently has forced you guys to have one AOK and then you have some freedom and flexibility to choose the other one. This one is wide open, so I do think if it's okay with everyone to go through all of our AOKs and see how this works. But admittedly, I think it's fair to say that this concept of replicability is a scientific concept. It kind of comes from the natural sciences. So when we think about that, I just want to start us off by thinking of this easy case then. Because if replicability comes from the natural sciences, let's just quickly see how that works. So one example I thought of in physics, since secretly I'm a physicist, if we're measuring gravity all over the planet, well, most of us have learned in IB physics that what is little g, 9.8 meters per second squared. So we can measure that acceleration all over the planet, and we're going to find some fluctuations and differences, but it's going to be roughly similar, and different groups and teams of researchers can conduct that at different space and different times. And so that will get this honorific label of a replicated experiment. But other experiments and other AOKs especially, this kind of exactness, especially numerical exactness that we see in physics, is very hard to come by. So not only will we see that this replicability is hard to achieve in other AOKs, but maybe it's not even something we're after. Okay, and then the last thing I say before we get into this is this word same that I mentioned in our definition. That's going to be really crucial, especially when we get away from this numerical precision of our first example of physics. Again, physics is going to be this kind of rare case where we can have precision. We can get 9.8 meters per second squared, roughly, all over the planet. But otherwise, what same means, we want to be a little bit rougher, more approximate with sameness. So sameness, I think, amounts to repeating what matters in an experiment or a process of inquiry. And what matters are these 3 things. So I want us to think about these 3 things. Whenever any of us mentions the word sameness, the original researcher's specifications, or their instructions on how to, their methodology or their experimental setup, their specifications, the original researcher, that's important. We need to try to preserve that in sameness. But also the technical skills, how we go about running the experiment or the process of inquiry. So that methodological component is supremely important, perhaps the most important. And then I'd add in some common sense too. And then this is going to come into play too when we're thinking about approximate, rough notions of sameness. Okay, so that said, I'm happy for you guys to think more about the natural sciences, but I think jumping into some of these other AOKs that are more challenging could be interesting. So my first question for the panelists, if we shift over to, let's say, the human sciences, in particular psychology, one thing that's happened in recent years is there's been kind of a crisis in psychology, in particular a replicability crisis. Professional psychologists have been accused of not being able to replicate their findings. So on the surface, we don't need to dive into those results, but how do we feel about the prospect of replication within a field like psychology? Do we think that's necessary?
So I can start with that. So human scientists primarily are like natural scientists in that they use the scientific method. So they're bound by the same steps, including peer review and replicability. So if you're an experimental psychologist, it's vitally necessary that your findings are replicable. Now, if you're a psychologist who does therapy, for instance, and you find that you've said something that has helped a particular client, or let's say you find that for one client, a certain element in someone's past has led them to develop a certain condition. That doesn't need to be replicable to be useful. But for an experimental psychologist, replicability is essential. It's not even, I would argue, it's not even knowledge in the human sciences if it's not replicable, if it's an experimental human science.
I think shared previously that for human science, especially psychology, like it's important to be replicable.
I told you it's hard
Yes,
to say.
replicable.
Yeah.
But if it crosses a ethical boundary, such as they did in the Milgram experiment or the Murray experiment, where scientists experimented a group of people who later developed, symptoms of, PTSD or trauma, something like that. In these scenarios, maybe this experiment should not be repeated for accuracy because there is long-term trauma associated with it. Does that make sense?
So if it crosses, to
And the
quote a
boundary.
previous PT, if it crosses a boundary of investigation, that would be a reason to not even attempt replication.
Yes.
I would certainly agree with that.
Interesting ethical considerations in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, like moving a little bit from psychology, I think even for economics, it's important to a certain extent because a lot of the ideas, like for example, a recession. Do you want a recession to occur, consistently for economists to have an idea about what are the causes behind it? That would certainly be an idea like why it should not be repeated. It will cause more harm than it ever happening. However, people would say recessions are inevitable, just like the up and down of the economic cycle. So you cannot argue that it's not going to happen, but this repetition would help you.
Yeah. So that's fantastic, and I want to interject here because Namita, actually in the background, Namita, you're bringing up another key distinction in our discussion, I think, going forward. And this would be the distinction between, let's call them closed systems and open systems. So in some of those examples you mentioned, Namita, there's something about the openness and the real world application that's essential for generating the knowledge. Whereas in our classical case of the physicist, again, in his or her laboratory, he or she has the convenience of a closed system. He's got this contained, controlled space in his or her laboratory to really kind of keep the variables controlled, but that's not always going to be the case across AOKs. So I wonder, if our answer to this PT is going to vary depending on that distinction. Even in natural sciences, so like weather, for example, meteorology, you can think about the study of weather science often requires open systems. We can't contain weather in a room to study it. And so the very idea of controlling variables becomes problematic there, even as a natural science.
I think you also have to look at the idea of replicability in terms of, do you have to be able to replicate it at all times? And is it 100% replicability? Such as like if I throw the marker up into the air, it comes down, and pretty much 100% of the time that's going to be the case. Now in psychology and economics, I don't know that that's going to be the case. Like when you mentioned, oh, this strategy worked with one patient.
Sure.
Well, maybe it works with 92 out of 100 patients, but then there's those other 8 for which it does not work.
Sure.
Does that produce knowledge because it's not always replicable?
I
And
think
same with economics. Like, okay, we can talk about recessions, what causes recessions, what you do to alleviate a recession. And okay, well, for many, many recessions, the strategies that central banks or politicians take, they're going to be effective. But then, because they're such open systems, every situation is very, very different. And so, okay, maybe we can help prevent a severe recession 95% of the time, but like right now, the conditions are so much different than everything else that we have seen. Well, we haven't produced the knowledge yet to kind of prevent the severe recession that we otherwise might be able to prevent.
Yeah, about what you said about
I told you.
replicability, yes.
She's all going, say it once.
Predicted So what you said earlier about replicability and sort of its limitations, how it works for, like, in the example, 92% of a sample group, and then the 8% it doesn't work on. It definitely does expand knowledge because it informs the psychologist, perhaps, that that method may not work for that amount of people, and you'll have to come up with a different strategy. But there's also, like what Namita said earlier, like ethical limitations, like that definitely ties into the quality of something being replicable to produce knowledge. And like in order for something to be replicated, it has to be replicable in the first place. So there's definitely limitations within human sciences compared to other areas of knowledge when it comes to replicability, producing the knowledge.
Right.
I actually love that distinction between something that is replicated versus something that could not even stand to be replicated.
Yeah.
And that makes me think of other avenues of psychology and where they're not as experimental.
Yeah.
So replication may not apply to the same degree.
Yeah.
I think, just back to natural sciences for a second, I mean, certainly if it pertains to a drug that we're taking, and the drug has been proven effective in 1 out of 10 trials, safe and effective in 1 out of 10, and ineffective in 9 out of 10, we don't want to take that drug. But these are cases where, obviously, the effectiveness and the safety of a drug, it can be replicated and it should be replicated. In parts of the human sciences that are less experimental, like economics and certain aspects of psychology, you have conclusions that may not even be falsifiable. They may not even be testable to begin with. Like the idea that, let's say, trauma causes a certain psychological illness. It is undoubtedly true. It's undoubtedly helpful for people to understand themselves through that lens, but this is not something that can be tested in an experiment. Because obviously, in the same way as we're not going to cause a recession, we are not going to do an experiment that imposes that kind of thing on someone to see what happens.
Absolutely, yeah, and the emphasis on that suffix that both of you guys are saying, the able, replicable, falsifiable, the possibility, and I think that goes back to one of these components of sameness. Like if the experimenter doesn't have clear instructions of how to run their experiment or process of inquiry, then I think it doesn't pass the test that you guys are referring to. It's like a down-to-earth example here is I think of my Thai friends giving me recipes for cooking. That's a culinary experiment, but it turns out their recipes are highly unclear. I want measurements and specific, amount of sugar, but it's never any of that. It's a pinch of this, a pinch of that, and so, I have proof that I can't replicate Thai cuisine as much as I want to. I promise you. So
that could be a good segue into the arts, actually.
Let's go to the arts.
Yeah.
Let's go to the
Because
arts.
maybe cooking is an art, but maybe that idea of like, can you follow a recipe that's somewhat precise but not completely precise, reminds me of in musical performance, for instance. You have cases where in classical music, you have a score, the composer wrote it, and the composer wrote dynamic markings, wrote the notes down, but still, and that is a form of a recipe. And you want replicability, you want consistency from one performance to the next. Nevertheless, even though you have specific instructions in the same way as you do for a recipe, you're not going to get the same thing every time. There's room to interpret in the moment. But I would say in certain kinds of musical performance, replication is really important, right? You want to have consistency. In others, I think of this idea of free jazz, where it's you're not only taking a style of music that's improvised to begin with, but you're going even further and you're saying, we're not even going to use the same chord changes that are predetermined.
Yeah.
We're going to pure spontaneity. We're going to make it up purely on the spot. So in that case, replicability is not only not necessary, it's not desirable. If you replicated a jazz performance, that would be something to actively avoid. That would diminish the quality of it.
I would say for the arts, it kind of raises a question innovation versus invention. When you're maybe not copying a style, but taking inspiration, which is I feel like is a kind of a way you're repeating something, if you take inspiration,
Mm.
you're already like, it's not original anymore. But then what is original? You know, that as you said, like if somebody is producing music on the spot, like jazz on the spot, they're not replicating, like the knowledge that they're producing is not necessarily like being like copied from somebody else. It's they're improvising on the spot. However, if like singers, they take notes from other singers from the past or other styles, they are repeating, and maybe that kind of deters the production of knowledge that would be completely new and create grounds for, you know, like invention.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I understand the concept of increasing musical knowledge. Like, what does it mean to produce musical knowledge?
I think you can take it as like the musical performance.
I would guess that the production of knowledge in music or in the arts basically requires innovation and not replication. It's like you have to do something new.
Well, there's an interesting cultural contrast here, though, because we can think of some perhaps Asian traditions that have an extra kind of honorific layer of replicating previous artists.
But I mean, that's always done in art. No one is doing something that's so new that, oh, it's like they've grown up in a vacuum and this has never been done before. Like, there's a progression of music, like, because musicians have listened to musicians from the past and they're gaining all of their knowledge by listening to those musicians and then building upon that, adding on little by little. And so I don't know like how if replicability is as important in this area of knowledge as it might be in, say, physics and chemistry.
Yeah. The arts is such an interesting example for this. There's a concept that you just made me think of. This guy Harold Bloom, he's a literature professor at Yale. He's like 150 years old, but he has this concept of the anxiety of influence, that all writers produce the unique work that they produce because they're trying to avoid writing in the same way as other writers write. So like the key thing motivating innovation in the arts is like, you know that you've been unconsciously inspired by all these people, but you have this drive to be unique or have your own voice. So I think maybe we're getting to this idea that like avoiding replication is, in the arts, is often the driver of progress.
I would say like literature is a kind of art, if you would see, like think about it. And in literature, like there is not a lot of replication like happening. For example, Shakespeare has a very unique style versus somebody else like Jane Austen. So in the way I perceive it, like they're not necessarily repeating each other's style. The way they're both writing, the content, the theme, the mood, the choice of words, they contrast and they vary, like, you know, extensively. So in this case, in literature, like as Mr. Babon was saying, like replicability is not necessarily important. However, like there are some ideas that somebody, like for example, like Shakespeare has said, like some theme, some symbolization that might have inspired future writers or authors or poets to, you know, maybe not copy but take inspiration from and create their own style of writing. So what would you think of that?
I agree completely. Yeah, that's what's going on. But I think Tyler, you want?
Yeah, so like as far as replicability goes in the arts, definitely not as important in relative to other AOKs. And like I'm gonna go back to the cooking example. Like for example, I cook, so I look at recipe videos on YouTube. I do my best to like uphold the exact measurements because there's always the measurements there. But if it's not to my satisfaction, then I will like adjust it to my taste. So like that's where replicability like sort of sparks that innovation, like because you're not producing the same result at the end of the day. You're producing something different, and you're using replicability as sort of that catalyst to get to that point in the arts.
It's almost that you're describing like the constraint of the recipe, or the instructions of the recipe are in a way the thing that enables you to
Right,
almost transcend
right.
the recipe or the
And-
instruction.
Yeah, and you guys are all touching upon, we see this in theories of innovation too, especially in the business world. Like, it's not enough just to innovate and have a, moment of uniqueness. It needs to be kind of brought into normalcy and familiarity as well for it to stick and last a long time. So, like, maybe in the arts what we're saying is like, we always need a sprinkling of novelty or uniqueness, but it needs to be kind of constrained, as Mr. Markowitz said, by the traditions of the past. In order for us to be, somewhat comfortable with it, sometimes complete innovation scares us, and it definitely doesn't get the platform that it often deserves.
In theater, if the actor completely went off the script, might be a problem.
Right.
For both the writer, the director, and
Maybe they
the
have
audience too.
improvisational music, you could have an improvisational play, I think that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
then,
yeah.
like, when you think about it, like, even though there's replicability in plays, right? It's not an exact result. It's not the same exact result because everyone's so different. Everybody's been affected by different things, and they just happen to be actors that are trying to replicate a concept, not exactly the actual original play to the T.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
When you think about how different they all are, but so similar at the same time.
Right, right. Related to what Tyler's bringing up, and I do want to eventually move into the other AOKs, but the last thing perhaps we can think about in the arts is, and what's lovely about the arts is the translation between media and the arts. And so, I mean, one constant thing we see is we have a book that becomes popular and famous, and it gets turned into a film eventually. So these kind of translations between media and the arts. And we think about it, we didn't plan for this, but that's a fascinating subtopic of this PT, because often you get these polarizing opinions where people love the book, it's one of their favorite books, and then they see the movie, they hate the movie. That's a common human phenomenon. Actually, the inversion is kind of rare, I feel like.
No, but
But
it has happened.
It has happened.
I was just looking at this article where this girl, she wrote a book,
Yeah.
but she didn't even release it, but it became a New York Times bestseller with the movie. And that's before she even released it. Now it's released, but it all became through TikTok where she posted what the book was going to be about, not even what it was, like the full version.
Yeah.
It's called like Lark, if anybody wants to check it out. But I mean, it's just fiction, but it has happened. And I think nowadays it's happening more often because there's like TikTok and other
Yeah.
social media influences where if like some celebrities or like sponsored, it becomes immediately a hit. But in this case, there was no like outside influence versus just her putting out her idea, like this is what it is,
Yeah.
and people like loving it and they're
Right.
into it. And I think like Colleen Hoover, she's one of the biggest writers right now. So her books, like even before it's being released, it's like there's a giant, popularity and audience for it, and movie production houses are picking up on it.
Okay. Yeah.
Like what I find to be quite interesting, don't even get me started on how bad movies interpret books, right?
Yeah.
So like when I was younger, I used to read the series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket.
Yeah.
Love that series. But the movie, or like I think it was a movie, yeah. With,
There was also a
Jim
show.
Carrey as Count Olaf.
Okay.
It was quite
Hey
interesting.
Jim, if you're watching.
So, like, they definitely went off script, and I don't like that idea of going off script when it comes to such a good book.
Mm.
However, I read manga and I watch anime as well. In some cases, like in the Dragon Ball Super manga, the anime does a completely different sort of interpretation of the storyline. But like in an anime like Demon Slayer, like I've read the entire manga, the anime follows the coherence of the manga to the T, to the letter. Like there's never been an inconsistency. The only difference is that one is animated and the other is readable.
Right, right. Yeah, so when we get these polarizing opinions, we're, there's always, in all these examples we talked about, there's one camp that says, oh, this other medium does not do justice to the original medium, and then we get all these, like, hate. But then other times people are of this opinion, well, it's its own thing, that's a separate medium, and they think it doesn't need to be attached to the essence in the other medium. And I don't know, I wonder, how does that impinge upon our PT? I know we're not gonna solve that tension, but replicating between, because what we're talking about here is translation, which is an art in itself. So translating between media, in any case, we can move on, but let's flag that for people that are inspired by this topic. That would be a great thing to focus on in your essay. If you guys don't mind, perhaps we'll briefly visit history with respect to this PT. So I'm just going to leave this wide open. Let's remind ourselves of this PT again. Is replicability necessary in the production of knowledge? And I don't know, recently on the internet, I came across a statement produced by a human. And he said, quote, "I see stuff happen on the day that later that day is reported wrong. So how wrong is something reported 1,000 years ago?" End quote. Okay. This was made by a particular individual who's all over social media currently.
Yeah.
Remains unnamed. That's okay. Yeah.
Oh, we will keep it unnamed?
Perhaps the name will come up.
Oh,
Mr.
okay.
East.
Mr. East. There we go. Yeah. We'll use an alias. Yeah. Mr. East. Yeah. He has definitely changed his cardinal direction. For sure. Yeah.
Well, actually we were discussing this earlier on, and I kind of agree to an extent what he said. To an extent, obviously not fully, because one of the arguments was that the history is written by the winners. That's what the person mentioned, and to an extent that is true. Coming from a country that was once colonized by England, I've seen the way some people perceive figures like Winston Churchill online, and actually I've gone into arguments about this where they have said that he's such an important figure, he played an important role for World War and all that, but also at the same time he was the cause of the death of millions and millions of people in Bengal by diverting resources from Bengal to England and other European countries. So he caused a huge massacre, well not massacre, what would be the word? Starvation, I guess, and which resulted in the death of I think around 6 million plus Bengalis. So to an extent, maybe if history is seen by what it is, like what happened and what is being interpreted, they vary widely. That's what I would say. Obviously, that's not true for all instances, especially the more known cases. But for coming from a minority country where situations are perceived not just in black and white, not like the scenario where Winston Churchill is a good man, white versus a bad man. That may be there's still a gray area, but in this instance, I would say, not necessarily true.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your statement about the general sense being the winners get to write the history. And an example where that wasn't the case would be the Lost Cause movement and how racial discrimination toward African Americans were still upheld in the South. So it really I would say it definitely questions the integrity of replicability in history if we have multiple sides to one story or one linear path of historical events, but no real truth because of the clashing sides. And only the victor, or not only the victor, but the victor generally being the one to dictate how the history will be interpreted in the future.
So I think the part of this line that struck me is, so he said when something happens today and I read about it, it may be somewhat off. So how much more off or inaccurate is it going to be when the thing happened 1,000 years ago? And so as I turn this over in my mind, I think, okay, I think it's backwards. I think in fact it's more difficult to understand things that are happening currently than it is to understand things that have happened, let's say 100 years ago. I mean, if I want to understand a war that's going on currently in all its fullness, it's going to be much more difficult to understand that than it would be to understand World War II. Why? Because more evidence has come out, more people who participated speak, and also there's less incentive to misrepresent something that happened historically. There's much more incentive to misrepresent something that is currently going on because you could affect the result. Whereas in history, presumably the event is over or has been over for some time. It's quite a bit easier to understand the full picture when some time has passed.
I think there's definitely some truth to that. Not all truth, because even going back a few generations, people living today still feel that they have some skin in the game on what happened, and so they're certainly, as like Namita was talking about Winston Churchill, there's still people who revere Winston Churchill for one reason or another. I mean, he is a very complex person, and so they are going to lean one way or the other when they write about him. And I think to the original comment, we do seem to think that we understand so much of what happened in history, especially like ancient history. We assume, okay, well, we know what happened. But in reality, there's really not that much that we have from ancient history. I mean, how much written text do we have that goes back 2,000, 3,000 years? Right? I mean, there's very little that exists today. Right? I mean, it's like if you think about ancient Egypt, right? What written exists today? Nothing, really. It's like 99.9% of everything that was written in ancient Egypt is gone.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, what do we have? Now we're left more or less with archaeology and archaeological evidence.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense we can talk about replicability and what one archaeologist finds and what another archaeologist finds, and do they kind of conform, or do they tell us the same story? Do they tell us very different stories?
Yeah.
And even then, it's like, how do you interpret these findings? I guess there are things like radiocarbon dating, and there are certain ways of analyzing archaeological finds and the artifacts.
Yeah.
I think some of the discussion today on the earliest settlements of the Americas, right? So many archaeologists and historians say, well, you know, the Americas were settled 14,000 years ago. And then there are others who claim, oh, we found evidence that it was settled 50,000 years ago. Well, okay, can you replicate this in any way, these findings in any way that would improve our understanding of, well, were human beings actually in North America 50,000 years ago? And can you find something that would support that everyone would agree on, or most people would agree on?
I would say the word, because replicability is so tied to the experimental sciences, I think the word I would use in history is corroboration. That in order for something to be established as historical fact, it needs to be corroborated. Like, we're not just going to take one eyewitness statement that something happened as establishing a fact. It needs to be corroborated, whether that's through writing or some new evidence.
I mean, it brings up 25 years ago was the first time that anyone found a reference to King David outside of the Bible. And they found it on some, I guess, little scrap of metal or pottery, and it said like House of David. And that's it. It's like, Okay, outside of the Bible, that is the only piece of evidence that exists anywhere in the world that King David existed. And people are taking that today as like, well, and this wasn't even an Israeli or an Israelite artifact, it was from another kingdom. And so archaeologists and historians are looking at this and saying, well, you know, this is strong corroboration for the fact that there actually was some historical King David. And that does lead to the production of knowledge.
Right, and go ahead, Mina.
I want to say that all the religious knowledge is no longer a-okay now, but I think this idea, like in Islam, Judaism, Christianity, there are so many ideas which collaborate. Like in Islam believes that both Noah and Christ are prophets of God. So like these ideas are replicated in various religions, you know, to an extent or the other. There is also belief, like in Islam, it believes that, you know, the Bible and I think one of the books in Judaism, I'm not sure, they're also one of the holy books for Islam. So there are ideas which collaborate, you know, religious ideas which collaborate with other religions, especially Christianity and Judaism, and that, you know, maybe that could play a role in, you know, we could say that there is a similarity to an extent. I don't want to go too deep into it in case, you know, some people get offended, but that's just something that is in the holy book of Islam, which is the Quran, that these people, like these ideas that are present in both religions and even in some other kind of religions, they're also in the same book of Islam. So.
I was just going to add in one metaphor that comes to mind when we're focusing on the human sciences. It seems like, especially Mr. Boulogne, your example of a singular piece of evidence, which back to our classic example of physics and the natural sciences, where we can have these self-contained experiments, and if they give us this radically wrong result, then we are forced to revise all these things. But in history and human sciences, we're often dealing with this web of beliefs and web of facts, this very complicated jigsaw puzzle. And so it strikes me as being perhaps an appropriate metaphor, because if we just have a singular piece of evidence, in the case of physics, that's not going to be enough. But in history, maybe it is, because at least it's consistent with all the other facts that are corroborated.
Because when you're going back 3,000 years, you don't have anything.
Right.
Right? I mean,
Right.
and then you actually find one artifact.
Yeah.
And you're not going to find books and books and books written on King David. They just don't, even if they existed 3,000 years ago, they don't exist anymore.
Right.
Right? They've turned to dust.
But do you think that is enough? Like, replicability, one of the things it does is that it reduces bias. So, and it reduces like the way something is interpreted. So maybe like the King David, what was it? The stone.
It was found on a piece of stone.
Yeah,
or
this
pottery.
stone. Maybe like it's just like perceived. Like it opens itself to different ways to be perceived. Do you think that is enough to?
It might not be enough, but it's something that corroborates his existence. Whereas before there was never anything.
And I think it gets even harder. We're just talking about like the difficulty of establishing historical fact. Then it gets even more complicated when you try to give a theory of history or even a law of history. We have ideas of historians that have a Marxist bent will say that we can predict what's going to happen in history. I think the line goes, you know, if people in a society are starving, they are hungry. Thank you.
Supporting
audience
the
member.
government.
They're hungry, they're jobless, and they hate the government. There's going to be a revolution. Now, in order to accept that, it wouldn't be enough to see that those conditions lead to revolution in one society. Of course, we would need to see that in a critical mass of other societies before we accepted that as a sort of a law of history. That if these three conditions are in place, revolution is going to happen.
Marx
So
sees so far into the future that none of his predictions have come true yet. That's the sad.
yeah.
But there's always more time.
One of the predictions that I really want to talk about is Malthus's theory, where he said that overpopulation would lead to world, destruction and some stuff like that. So I think like Malthus's theory obviously predicts what he would say the inevitable, but it hasn't happened yet. I mean, we're all still alive. But do you think this is like, although like we're seeing some instances of that in some isolated events, you could say like in one of the areas in Bangladesh where it's super isolated, there because Bangladesh is extremely overpopulated. To those who don't know, it's one of the most, if not the most densely populated country in the world. So there is a lack of resources, there's lack of food, there's lack of everything that is, and also there's the intensified events of climate change. And Bangladesh is not only the scenery, there's also Tuvalu, which is an island that is although not overpopulated, but experiencing the events. So in these cases, like there are tons of people who are dying from disease, lack of innovation of medicine, and overpopulation to an extent. So maybe like this idea would be more important if you saw this effects in other places more than just isolated scenarios.
Yeah, like what just came to me, like now that I gave it some more thought, it's nearly impossible for replicability to exist in history. Like I just thought about this. Like if we were to just erase the memories of all historical events right now, just start on a clean slate, right? And we'd still have
That's
the
what
capacity.
Kanye wants. Oh, I said his name wrong.
I mean,
sorry.
like
We apologize.
honestly, what he's saying is quite logical. It has logos. Like it's not a completely stupid statement to make. This is definitely logical. Like if, for example, if everybody's brain was just erased, like not their brain but their memory of historical events were erased, and everyone still had their biases, then like if you go on to the future, all the events starting from that clean slate are just going to be interpreted in different ways, which will just restart the cycle of all these different interpretations of historical events. So I don't see replicability like existing in the definition of achieving the same results.
If you take away your memory of history, you almost by definition take away their biases as well.
No, like just leave the biases historical.
I would like to make one statement here. Everybody is aware of that history repeats itself. So, in one way you're saying like that statement in that scenario would be completely retracted. Is that what you're trying to say? That history won't repeat itself? Tyler?
Like it would repeat itself in the sense of how it's going to be interpreted by people. Everybody's different, they're going to interpret it differently, and there will be conflicting opinions. There's not going to be one like linear opinion that everybody like believes and falls under.
So both of you guys are bringing up biases now, so I do want to interject and bring up another key subtopic that we haven't touched upon yet, namely outliers. So this is another thing that involves biases, and this is what psychology has been hit with in their crisis too. If we run an experiment or a process of inquiry, regardless of AOK, and we've got Mr. Bravoni here, okay? So we've got, imagine, IB students, we've got something that a linear model would be pretty appropriate for. We've got a plot, and most of our data points are along the line in linear fashion, but hey, an otherwise professional researcher has, let's say, 3 points of data off the linear regression pretty significantly, but those 3 data points pales in comparison to the thousands of other data points. And so there's this interesting experimental question that often arises, again, especially in the human sciences, but how do we feel about this aspect of experimentation, the rejection of outliers in order to claim that we've successfully replicated a result?
This is like what we talked about with psychology and economics, right? There are certain situations that don't fit with the rest.
Right.
But looking at them as being different does allow you to learn something and increase your knowledge. Why are they so far off from the others?
I mean,
And it may be error in your measurement, or there may be some other reason why they do not fit the standard model.
What about like best fit lines? You know, like when we're like drawing a graph, like the teachers often tell us, right, just draw the best fit line. Why are we in that scenario? We're always ignoring the 1 or 2 outliers.
Well, I think that's what he's talking about. It's like, we don't necessarily have to ignore them, but in order to increase your understanding of the situation, you try to explain why they are different from the others.
Right. I guess my sub-question here then is, if we're aspiring to replicability within the natural and human sciences, if we take this as a criterion of success, something we're aspiring towards, will that blind us to this extra important step of wondering about the origin of outliers? If we're really after replicability and falsifiability, and we want to get the same results to make it more solid, will it bias us in skipping over these extra important questions that you're mentioning, Mr. Bone? Like, I wonder why I got this anomalous data, instead of kind of an immediate, well, it's only 2 or 3 amidst the 1,000 data points.
I think that most times in the physical sciences, when you find a situation like this, it's generally because some error has occurred.
I think the biggest disaster is to truly ignore the outliers. I mean, part of the replicability crisis in the sciences is a publishing or a reporting bias, is that the experiments, let's say in a drug, because that's an easy example, it's proven effective once, proven not effective in 9 out of 10 times. Which one gets reported? The one outlier. The one outlier gets published. And this is why some people think actually currently replication is the last step of the scientific method. It happens after publication. And so a lot of people think actually we might do well to reverse those things and not publish until we've replicated, to avoid this kind of reporting bias where we're misleading people. We're only reporting the 1 out of 10 times that, in my example, the drug's effective. We're reporting the outlier, or I guess this is a case really of focusing on the outlier and ignoring the line of best fit,
Right.
in a sense.
Right.
I mean, it certainly reduces replicating a result several times reduces the margin of error.
Yep.
So, like it gives us greater predictive power in a sense.
Yeah, well, now that we're on statistics, let's use this as a perfect segue into our final AOK, mathematics. After all, we do have Mr. Bavone here. And what's happening in math world, I notice, is something quite peculiar, that there's recent mathematicians that make statements that refer to just how complex and complicated math at the professional level really is now. And what's interesting is a lot of mathematicians that are already highly knowledgeable of their subfield, they struggle to understand the proofs of each other. So there's this new phenomenon where people have suggested computer verification of mathematical proofs. It's the second layer of checking, and if we think about it, it's almost like a form of replication. We're trying to kind of outsource making sure that this proof gets a stamp of approval by sending it to the computer. And again, why is this happening? Well, simply put, math is just so complex, even for the professionals. So they send it in the peer review process, like Mr. Markowitz was talking about. They publish a paper. Fellow mathematicians, they want to say that this is replicable, repeatable. So they run the proof in their own head, but they don't have this highly specialized and complex knowledge that the original practitioner has. So they have to depend upon their own knowledge base, these kind of informal axioms, intuitions that they walk around with. And then eventually we've gotten to the point in the 21st century where now the mathematicians say, you know what? We're going to give it to the computers. That's how we're going to double check this.
It's understandable. You could also interpret it as this: the replicability stems from you're using math to program the computer, give it the algorithm to verify another mathematical theorem. So you're using an already complex mathematical sequence to identify an even more complex sequence.
Right.
I think the problem that you described, it sounds much more like a peer review problem. It seems like the problem that you're describing where either mathematicians don't peer review because
But
they can't peer review.
This is
Means that the mathematicians don't really have true peers if other people can't understand their results.
Well, I think, I'm happy you're saying that, Mr. Marquis, and I think that's what makes mathematics unique as an AOK for us in DOK, because math, I would argue, I'm not supposed to be part of the panel, but now I'm giving an argument, math is the only self-contained discipline, so the peer review process itself gets absorbed into the AOK, whereas like in the world of science, you know, we've got this external world supposedly that we can check upon to see if it corresponds with our theories. But there's something special going on in the math community where it's completely self-contained. The mathematicians, they don't need anything beyond themselves and their community.
But it's like you're talking about, we're running up against the limits of comprehension and
Yeah.
ability.
Yeah,
So if no one else is able to do it or able to comprehend it, can you replicate it? Like, you can even think of art.
Yeah.
If no one else is able to do what Michelangelo did, well, have we learned anything about art? I mean, are we progressing? Well, I can't do it, you can't do it, no one else does it.
Yeah.
Only he could do it. So
He can do it, but others can understand it.
others can understand, but they can't do it. So have we like improved the actual practice of art if no one else can even do it? And it's like the same idea with these proofs.
yeah,
Someone or claims to have proven it and has written down a proof, which may be pages and pages,
yeah,
reaching hundreds of pages, who knows?
yeah.
But if no one else can understand what this person has done, okay, what good is the proof? Is it
Yeah.
valuable?
But
Does it
really, I mean,
peer
you can't
reviews?
But
No.
there are
Yeah.
some cases like where, you know, there is like, I don't know, like you were saying, some math has been unsolved. Like I was just looking up, there are seven unsolvable equations that to this day haven't, and I don't think, and they probably use like IT, like and they're the most genius
6, I
mathematicians.
believe one was solved.
Oh, one was solved, so it's 6 now, but
Yeah.
we have 6 unsolvable equations, so that nobody else has been able to do. And in this case, no matter how developed or, you know, innovative your software may be, it still cannot crack them. So, I mean, there is
And what would it mean if one person were to do this and no one else could understand what this person has done?
And we do have an RLS of that. So there's a Japanese mathematician who supposedly proved this ABC conjecture, not to be confused with the Pythagorean theorem, something very sophisticated. And he proved it, and his whole Japanese community agrees with him that the proof is successful. And the amazing thing here is not only are steps of his proof undecipherable for other mathematicians, but he invented whole new branches of mathematics in order to prove the result. And so again, there's this kind of like, perhaps we just have to wait for the rest of the math community to catch up with him in his group.
Or he might be completely wrong.
Or he could be wildly wrong.
I like how he sort of didn't break the rules, just made new ones that weren't already established.
Yeah,
So, I mean, that's
And maybe just in doing that, he produced knowledge.
yeah,
new knowledge,
Yeah.
changing established values and beliefs.
yeah. All right, so.
Editorial note from a TOK exhibition.
Totally didn't take that from my
Perfect, perfect. All right, on that note, and it's exactly 6 o'clock, perfect. If panelists don't mind, open up to our huge audience. Internet doesn't know how massive the audience is. Yeah, so questions from the audience? Mate?
Recalling what Tyler just said, he just reminded me of what Mr. Marcus showed us in class and he was prohibited of doing. He showed us the Kanye example and it reminded me exactly of what Tyler said. Like,
Okay.
wait.
So Tyler was replicating?
Yeah, Kanye.
So
Thank you, Mate. Kuba?
I have a question. So I remember the Mr. Pavone example in history, right? Like the vase one or whatever, like the metal one. Isn't that kind of confirmation bias? You know, we have the Bible, we have like people's scriptures, what people said, then we might be looking for the answer rather than actually seeing what the answer is.
No, I mean, these are archaeologists, they're excavating in some site in Lebanon or northern Israel, and they came across this artifact. And
Yeah.
as they sent it out for analysis and people were piecing it together and reading it, they just saw that it said this, House of David. And they had never seen anything like this before outside of the Bible. So it's not like they weren't looking for it, they just happened to find it.
Yeah, what I mean is like when they found it, House of David.
Oh, right, it could be David Markowitz.
David Markowitz, exactly.
Possible,
Right,
right?
in fact, King David's last name was actually Mark.
It could be.
Yeah, no, I'm not disproving your argument. I'm just like putting it out there that all of the knowledge that we have of history could just be confirmation of our previous evidence. Just like we're looking to confirm our previous evidence by looking for it. Maybe not in this case, but in many other cases, when we have some unproven thesis or something that had happened, when we find something new, we want to know, right? We want to see if we want it to be true.
So
As a
you're
personal
saying that replicating a result is just trying to confirm what you've established?
Sometimes in
And
history,
that could be, like, that is a form of bias?
it could be, yeah. That's what I'm trying to say. In history especially, with that there's evidence of what happened, we cannot see what happened,
Yeah.
before the camera, or even
Yeah.
now with the camera, we cannot see what is happening.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a great question, and
I just want to highlight that too, yeah, Kuba, because it brings to mind what Mr. Markowitz mentioned earlier about falsifiability. So not only history, but in the case of natural science, physics, like, Kuba, your observation really emphasizes an underlying problem here, because if the good scientist should be trying to disprove his or her theory constantly, that's what Professor Popper tells us, that's what you're supposed to do as a good scientist.
Supposed to.
Actively disprove and show to be wrong your theory, other theories, all theories. That's the job of the scientist. And at the same time, it's like, what is this other criterion replicability? There seems to be a tension there.
Yeah.
Kuba, I think you're putting your finger on that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm also thinking, even now in natural sciences, when you make a drug, you want it to work, right? Because you want to make a lot of money.
Of dollars
Yeah,
to
exactly.
make
So it is like
work.
in replicability, you might even lie or something, like it might be make it wrong.
Yeah.
and replication in the natural sciences has enough problems. I think you have phase 1 and phase 2 drug trials. Phase 1 is like the first experimental trial, then phase 2, and I think only like 18% or so of drugs are actually proven effective in phase 2. I wonder in the history example, how long had historians and archaeologists been looking for evidence that when they found it, it pointed it into a different direction, but they didn't report it. And so this is another case of like publishing the one piece of evidence that confirms what you want
And that,
to be true, and ignoring all the other ones. So you said like 25 years ago, this piece was discovered, and that's the one that made news, obviously made history, journals, but the pieces of null evidence that didn't point to
But,
it were not
Then,
reported.
then what would you possibly find that would disprove his existence? Right,
True.
I mean, what?
But lack
Okay.
of, but
Oh,
there's,
he never existed. I
but
mean,
there's
how do
no,
you have
but
proof
there's
of
no
that?
evidence that he did either.
Right, but I'm just saying, what would evidence be that he did not?
I
What is the possible evidence?
Or but they didn't report all the evidence that was inconclusive or didn't
Here-
decisively point
Yeah,
to that.
like that would require like collaboration, like we talked about. Maybe there were mentions of him like outside of the Bible in like other pieces of history,
And that's what I'm saying, they have never ever found that until a few decades ago.
I mean, yeah, but like one rock, I still think is not enough to prove
True.
the existence of an, what
But
coming
it
out
is
of.
the
But again,
first corroborating
what we-
evidence that
yeah,
exists.
I think what we discovered earlier.
But I'm trying to say that it's the first. It's a singular collaborative evidence, but there is no other like historians or like pieces of writing or art, architecture, or anything like that from other periods of time succeeding or preceding, well not preceding, but in this case succeeding, that would point to that direction. like this is coming from his, like history builds on itself. So if there was someone like this, there would be some kind of evidence or reference, further along the line.
I do have to mention too, Mr. Markowitz just brought to mind, there's certain thinkers and scientists of the past that did a really good job of not only publishing their positive results and findings, but their negative results too, their failed experiments. And Mr. Markowitz, I think we could both point to Freud probably. Freud is quite famous for this. Freud was great about publishing stuff that was failed. It's just an experiment that didn't go well. And it's out there for us to read. And like this, I think, is really absent in contemporary science. And perhaps that plays into this tension that Kuba, you discovered about. We want to replicate, but at the same time, the scientist is supposed to be falsifying too. So perhaps if we're more often sharing our failures, that could, diffuse some of that tension.
I think part of that gets at
Yeah.
the level of comfort that a practitioner has within their AOK. I mean, Freud did not really see himself as a scientist, certainly not an experimental scientist. So he may have been much more comfortable than perhaps, I don't want to psychoanalyze the entire scientific community, but I mean, there's a strong motivation if you're proving an experiment to have it replicated. And it's sort of an ego damaging to report that it is what you hope to find was not in fact the case.
You also have to take into account that the experimental science community is very competitive, and they're, just gonna say they're about the money.
Yeah.
So
this is the other thing that you guys are bringing to mind too, because we had a PT and TOK a couple years ago about disinterestedness.
But I would just say, it's not just the natural sciences, it's also in the human sciences. I just did a survey for my extended essay in a Grameen Bank, which is a bank which offers microcredit loans to underdeveloped areas, to women who are impoverished, etc., etc. And throughout that process, I realized that their results are globally published results are so positive, but that's not necessarily true, because you have the observer expectancy bias that I ran into while trying to conduct my survey, which was that since there were officials present in that room, and these surveys, they could be done repeatedly in different areas, and they could be continuously positive, and that might be because of the people who are present there. And even without the people present there, could be just the social, cultural pressure or force on them to give the positive answers. These women, they are so shy, they're illiterate, they have no voice at all. So even if you were to conduct this a survey, which is repetitively, replicate this, many times in different areas, you might have the same positive glowing answer, even though evidences might show otherwise, where they're suffering from high loans, their families are taking the loans, etc., etc. So there is that, possibility too, that a survey only shows one half of the story.
Yeah.
Or evidence shows one half of the story. It's just the way you interpret it.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Do you guys think that replicability can sometimes set back the progress that we made with the knowledge?
I'll tackle this one. So that's definitely interesting. I wouldn't say set back per se. I would say sort of slowing the process of the evolution of knowledge. Definitely identifying the limitations of replicability is a start to understanding new knowledge, but replicability is also good for validating facts. So I would say there are areas where it could be slowed down, but not halted or reversed.
It's another great question, by the way. I love that. I think replication is certainly a conservative force within the production of knowledge. I mean, it takes time. It certainly slows down the process of knowledge, but certainly in in the sciences, I can't think of an example where it would hold back the progress of science. But at the same time, it certainly is a conservative force. I mean, if we don't move forward with a piece of knowledge until it's replicated, certainly that slows things down.
I mean, Darwin's theory of evolution, is wrong. And that's actually something a lot of people don't know. I learned this in my environmental systems class where we discussed about this, and one of the ways they kind of came about this answer was by repeating the experiment with different species of animals, or different isolated instances of animals who are only available there. So maybe it doesn't set it back, but also it kind of helps gives a foundation for new knowledge to be brought in.
Cool. There was one other question, I
Good
think?
one.
Yeah.
So I can reverse the question. And so I was thinking, do you think that in some situations, the fact to not replicate anything can also project knowledge? I was thinking for that about an experiment that was presented to me during my listening test of the exam TOEFL, where we placed a group of monkeys in a room with the stairs, and on top of the stairs there was food. So naturally the monkeys tried to grab the food in order to survive. And what happened when they tried it? They got sprayed water all over during several days. And after some trials, one monkey was replaced by another monkey from another group who had no clue about the situation. And naturally, he tried himself to take the food, being not aware of the situation, that he would get sprayed. And the reaction from the other monkey were pretty aggressive. They literally attacked him, trying to prevent him from replicating this action, to copy the things that this monkey did. And so this process was repeated again and again and again until the original group completely disappeared. There wasn't any of the first monkeys that were in the room, and it was completely new group of monkeys. And none of them actually tried to jump on the stairs and take the food. And they didn't even know why they did that, why they couldn't do it. They just knew it was like this. It was just the rule. So in that case, the fact that they did not replicate the action, the fact that they were prevented to do it, produced the knowledge that it was maybe a danger if they took this food.
Almost sounds like the creation of certain religious and cultural practices. Right? It's like, we do something, we don't know why we do it.
Yeah.
But somewhere in the past, these people who existed, who no longer exist, they had a problem doing this.
And no, it reminds me of their famous quotations from physicists that have said, and this physics again is the classic case for us where we do want replication, we can do it, but physicists of the 20th century, a bunch of them said, hey, we're only really going to progress when the old generation dies, and us new generation will be able to carry on the new physics. And perhaps they're exaggerating, but there could be some truth value to that too. I mean, the question here in those examples, is the experimental setup being replicated? Is that too big of a change when they pull out one monkey and replace one? Is it the same conditions?
It's the same condition. It's just a monkey who isn't aware of the situation. They just literally took one of the monkeys, take it away, and they replaced it by a new one who didn't know anything. He just knew that there was food above the stairs, and he went to grab it. And then eventually, he got stopped by the other monkeys who were aware of the situations. And this process was repeated. And since a rule was installed to not go upstairs and not take the food, this rule was kind of universal for the monkeys in the room. So and even when actually none of the monkeys knew what was gonna happen. So
And then none of them actually have knowledge.
None of them have knowledge.
to what will happen to them if they grab it. So they could all eventually grab it. Nothing could happen because I don't know, the system was taken away, but they would not know it. They just know that it's like this. You don't go upstairs. You don't take the fruit.
I mean, that's also very, like, this idea is also prevalent in a lot of, like, cultural rituals, like, ideas, like, you know, in Islam, we had, or in Bengal, we had this thing called parda, where women were not allowed to, like, parda here means cloth, like curtain, so they weren't allowed to get out of, like, you know, go out and walk around, or go out of their rooms, or go out in the house when there is, you know, males or other foreign people who are not part of the family, and they just did it years after years and after years. They just did it just because they were supposed to, and they didn't question it. And it's something that we also do. We don't question a lot of the ideas. We don't. That's something that TOK kind of allows us to do. Is that why? Like, is this knowledge true? How is this knowledge produced? Why is this considered knowledge? All of these, I feel like, you know, people could explore into.
Yeah, you're definitely right. It's definitely societal conditioning and psychological conditioning. Society conditions people to think a certain way. That's why we have like the constructs of certain societies, and that's why, like, for example, I'm going to use Nazi Germany as an example. Hitler had people teach his ideology to children who are in their developmental state, and therefore are more prone to psychological conditioning, and therefore we're conditioned to embrace his ideology. Like, that's what a lot of societies use, and yeah, I definitely agree. TOK allows us to have a more abstract view of the world around us, which allows us to think outside of the box that is society.
Well, on that note, guys, I think we can say we're done with PT number 1.
Stay tuned for PT number 2.
Absolutely, yeah.
Next
Thanks
time.
again, panelists and audience. IB students in the world, please replicate your thoughts. Deeply in your desk. I need you to coach soccer.
Soccer?
Yeah.
That's why I'm here.
There we go. Oh yeah, no soccer.